Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naraban Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue our discussion on Vampire the Masquerade in the World of Darkness. We were talking about the dramatic systems. Let's talk about combat. An extension of these dramatic systems into a new and exciting area because there's plenty of times where you're going to have to hit someone. It attempts to correct that drama of a combat without getting rid of the fact that it's kind of visceral and dark and people die. Now, there are generally three types of combat that you're going to get yourself into. The firefight, which is basically projectile fighting. Usually it's gunfire, shooting out from cover between each other, maybe dodging out of the way behind something. There's the melee, which means you're fighting sword or dagger or axe, all against each other with that way. There's, of course, then unarmed, which is fighting fist to fist, claw to claw. All of these systems have the same basic rules. There are just little things between them that tweak the differences between them that make them each unique. But if you know the basics, you can run with any of these. Now, when you're talking about combat, you're going to start with, of course, some kind of attack roll based upon the type of combat you are. They may dodge out of the way. If they don't, they will get hit, and then you will have to worry about what kind of damage is being dealt to them, and that is the basic concept of combat. Of course, it will evolve around initiative, which will give you kind of order you're going in. Combat is divided into three main steps. I will go over most of them today. The first step is, as I talked about, initiative. I just mentioned that's what you're going to use to determine your order. Let's talk about it a little more. Now, initiative is taking place in both figuring out the order you're going in, but it also is determining what kind of actions you're going to be doing. You're going to declare the actions you will be taking first and foremost. I will say, I will do this. This person will say, we will do that. We will work down sort of the list, figuring out how that really functions. Everybody will roll a wits plus alertness difficulty 4 test. Now, of course, the difficulty could be altered depending on circumstances, depending on if your storyteller thinks it should be, but generally speaking, 4. Then you're going to arrange everybody in order from the highest amount of successes to the lowest. People that would tie go at the same time. If someone gets 0, they are dead last. If someone botches this roll, they lose their action. So once you have this order from top to bottom, that is when we begin to get into the meat of it. But for now, we have arranged everybody because of this initiative. At this point, you would, when you're declaring actions, you choose if you're splitting your dice pool between multiple actions or not. You always have the option of dodging. When you would dodge, you would subtract part of your dice pool that you're having, effectively split it off in order to dodge an attack. Even if you hadn't declared it, you are allowed to do that. Now when you're getting into the second step then, the attack. The attack takes place, first of all, the attack roll. That's going to be the critical part of this step when someone makes some kind of attack roll. If it's, for example, the projectile, it usually would be Dex plus Firearms. Melee is Dex plus Melee, and unarmed is Dex plus Brawl. Whatever weapon you're at is going to determine the difficulty, though there are times when using weapons in certain ways may increase said difficulty. There are circumstances around you which could change the difficulty also. These same sort of situations may also subtract or add to your dice pool, so you kind of have this fluctuation of your dice pool is going to be a basic amount. You might have something that gives you extra dice, something that subtracts dice. The same distance, if you're doing certain things that might increase your difficulty, it also might decrease your difficulty if you're doing other things. Circumstances are the most important thing when it comes to any of these. They will be key, and you're going to have to look at these circumstances for determining a lot. Now, of course, if you should fail an attack roll, it just misses. And if you should botch it, usually you leave yourself in some kind of terrible situation, your storyteller's discretion. Now let's move on from that and let's talk about the next part of this step, an important part, dodging, which is technically optional. No one needs to dodge. You never need to dodge. When you choose to dodge, you're subtracting for amount from your dice pool to dodge. You're basically using some dice to try to get out of the way. Now, of course, you don't, as I said, since you don't need to dodge, you would be subtracting from your dice pool. You can actually take the place of whatever action you were going to do or change your action completely to dodging if you really wanted to and take up your entire dice pool. It's just that it has that option that you can dodge anytime. The test is going to be dexterity plus dodge, and each success you get subtracts 1 from the successes the person got to hit you in the first place. The difficulty is going to depend on the type of combat. If it's melee or unarmed combat, the difficulty is going to start at 6, and it will add 1 for each extra person beyond the first that you're fighting in melee. So if I'm fighting 2 people in melee, it would be difficulty 7, 3 people 8. If I'm just hitting 1, it's difficulty 6. When you're talking about firearms projectiles, it will depend on the type of cover you have around you, something you can duck behind, or if you're just hitting the ground sort of when you're dodging. Each of those will have, according to a chart, a different difficulty that you're going to look at to make it as easy or difficult to dodge out of the way. If you're in certain circumstances, it's going to be really easy to get out of the way of firearms. On the other hand, there could be circumstances that could make it incredibly difficult for you to get out of the way of firearms. That it will make it a challenge for you personally to roll the dodge. Now, let's move on to the last step, conclusion of this, which is damage and soaking. So damage, each weapon will have a base amount of damage that it's going to do. If it is a firearm, for each success you got, you add an extra 1 to the base damage of said firearm. You do not do this for melee attacks and unarmed attacks. This is only in the case of firearms. The more successes you get, the more accurate they are, more damage you're dealing. In the case of unarmed and melee damage, you could still get extra damage. If you have potence, you add 1 extra success per level of it, 1 automatic success. So you do not have to roll your potence. For each potence you have, you just add extra damage when you're using melee or unarmed. Now let's talk about soaking, which is your ability to absorb the damage, because the damage is going to be represented by 1 damage is 1 level of health that the person's going to be taking. If you're getting hit by a lot of it, you're going to want to see if you can soak it and not take so much damage that you're being attemptedly to dealt. Soaking is basically how tough your body is to absorb the amount of damage you're taking. You're a vampire. You're kind of supernaturally tough. You can take a bunch. You will, of course, roll your stamina plus your fortitude difficulty 6. For each success you have, you reduce the amount of damage you're going to be taking by 1 level. To effectively, if you could soak it all, you take 0. After you've soaked it, whether you've soaked it all or not, any remaining damage is then dealt to you. Both of these rolls, damage and soak, are 2 of the exception to the botch rolls. You cannot botch on these. There are very few dice rolls that you would have, that you'd be rolling, that you wouldn't botch on if you rolled it. This is one of them. You cannot botch on these. Now let's talk about complications to these steps, because that's where the bread and butter of this entire setup comes down to. Complications. The first off is changing your action. I have declared my action. When my action comes up, for whatever reason, I need to change it. I am technically allowed to change it with my storyteller's permission. The storyteller will determine this by the circumstances normally, by what's going on. If I do change my action, whatever my next action is, the difficulty that I would have had is increased by 1 automatically because I changed my action, I changed my mind in those seconds that I had. You have to consider that a round is about 3 seconds. I don't think I mentioned that, but a round is about 3 seconds. So you don't have a lot of time in here. It could vary for the rounds, but 3 seconds is the base. So I am changing my action. Why? Maybe it's because of the situation. For example, if I'm getting into a car and a car explodes before I would get into it, I don't have that option really. Why am I going to get in a flaming car? The storyteller will more than likely give me an option to suddenly change my mind. I was racing towards the car. It's I do something else instead. Other circumstances could occur, like if the guy you're going to shoot at, he dies, or everybody dies and you're going to shoot at, that there's now no targets, though you're still technically in combat because there's someone around a corner. You're not going to try to shoot at them. That doesn't make any sense. Your storyteller will give you the option when things happen that you should change your action, you're allowed to. There are other times where you could, again, request it, but it's their discretion, and oftentimes you need an excuse for it. Now let's talk about attacking someone that's immobile. Now if someone's immobile but can still sort of struggle, try to get away, the difficulty to hit them is reduced by 2 for whatever you're attempting to do. It's easier to hit someone that's being pinned or bound, that's still struggling. If they're unconscious and incapacitated and not doing anything, it's a free hit. You don't have to roll. You just can shoot them or stab them or punch them. There's no resistance. Let's move on to talking about firearm complications, because there's a lot of firearm complication. So the first complication is range. a firearm will have a range listed to it. This is its medium range. If you can go up to twice this range, but if you are beyond your medium range, the difficulty automatically increases by 1. If you are basically right up next to piece, that's a point-blank shot. The difficulty is reduced to 4 from whatever it would normally be. It's really easy to shoot someone when they're right next to you. Still could miss, but pretty damn easy in comparison to farther away. Now there's also cover. There's a chart in the book that will tell you when someone you're firing at is in a certain amount of cover, it changes the difficulty. It will increase or decrease depending on how much cover the person has. Someone under a lot of cover is going to be much more difficult to hit than someone that's pretty much out in the open. That would be more of a standard attack. Now you also have more complications if you're moving. If you're moving at any kind of decent speed, it increases the difficulty by 1. This includes just, I'm running, I'm in a car that's traveling, things like that, that you're moving at a relatively decent speed. Now, there is a full chart of all of these and a few more that you can check in the book that will be a quick reference to see what kind of difficulty modifiers, what kind of modifiers that these checks will have. So you can quickly reference it and see how these different things will quickly affect you. Now, I want to talk about one more complication to firearms for today. I want to talk about aiming. Aiming gives you the option of adding up to your perception to your dice pool, to your firearms plus dexterity. You have to spend 1 round per dice you're adding to your pool. The target has to be moving at no faster than a walk. That means they virtually have to be either stationary or slowly walking around for your aiming to continue to count. They can't be like running, jogging in a vehicle. It will just screw that up. You have to continually spend those turns, and then after as many turns as you have perception, you add all those dice into it. But for every turn you get +1 die, again to the maximum of your perception. Now, if you have a scope and it's a gun, you automatically, when you're aiming, after the first aiming, get +2 dice. So that means basically, I say I have a perception, a 4. I want to spend 4 turns aiming. If I have a scope on my gun, the first turn I spend aiming, I get an additional 2 dice. So the first turn, 3 dice. I can then spend 3 more turns aiming for an extra 3 dice to a maximum 4 dice from my perception, 2 dice from my scope, to a total of 6 I have now added on to my normal hit to shoot and fire. And of course, since extra successes equals extra damage, yes, lots of damage. So that's it for today. I began to talk about the basics of combat. I talked about the 3 steps of combat: the initiative, the actual attack roll, and of course the results of the attack roll. I started moving into the complications of said steps, of what's going on to interfere with everything. I started with, of course, the firearm complications. In the next episode, I'm going to finish up the firearm complications, of course, move into the melee and the unarmed complications, and farther into the depths of combat in hopes of finishing up this book. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows your support for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, remember to check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.